Russia has already lost the war by the standards that it set itself at the beginning. Ukraine is now a hyper well-armed, hyper-connected test bed for the US and European defence industry. If they thought they were going to lose the territory to the Ukrainians, then I think we get back into the world that we were in at the age of 2022, where what the Russians did was start moving their nuclear weapons around and talking on channels that they knew the Americans could listen into, saying things like, we might need to use a tactical nuclear weapon.
Peter, we've been hearing about the potential collapse of the Russian war effort for years now. Is the Russian army generally on the brink of falling apart, or are we in the West comforting ourselves with a bit of wishful thinking?
So I think two things can be true about the Russian military at once. The first is that it has been really mauled in Ukraine, but it's bigger than when the war started. Russia still has a considerable population it can draw on, and there's speculation of another draft after local elections in the autumn. While it has lost a lot of tanks and kit and soldiers and all the things that make up a modern army, it is also one of the only real two combat experienced armies in the world in modern high intensity warfare. So in the phrase that one of my friends in Washington DC uses, there are only two armies in the world that really understand modern ground warfare at the moment, and they're the Ukrainians and the Russians, and they are unquestionably a very tough army. So if, to put this in a longer term context, Anthony Beevor, the great sort of British military historian, wrote the book on Stalingrad, believed that no American or British army could have survived the kind of intensity of conflict that was fought on the Eastern Front between the Germans and the Soviets. And I think there is a similar question, frankly, in the current era as to whether most sort of existing, British, American, European units how they would fare against an experienced Russian formation, which would be accompanied by thousands, if not tens of thousands, of drones. The Ukrainians and Russians have drones on a scale that no other armed forces have anything close to. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians, and this speaks to your point of the Russian army. The Russian army has had its drones taken off them and turned in and given to what they call an unmanned systems force, which is exactly what the Ukrainians have also done, and that is designed to have a single service, almost like a Navy or an Air Force, that just does unmanned systems. And that's designed to give them the ability to punch deep into each other's territory. It's designed to stop them breaking through on the front line. But it is a very different kind of power structure to the way in which conventional militaries operate. So I think, and the last point is that the Russian military is, of course, heavily maintained and supported by the Chinese industrial base. So Chinese components come into Russia. Without the Chinese industrial base, the Russian army would probably collapse in a matter of weeks. But no one believes that is going to stop. Lots of European officials have been there. I saw the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, speaking last week. She's been off to see her Chinese counterpart. All the Europeans have, and they say, could you please cut off supplies to the Russians? And the Chinese say no. So in that sense, they have issues, but some of those issues have become characteristics, and those characteristics are an extremely potent force that is experienced in doing something that the rest of us aren't.
What is the most terrifying scenario for the West if Russia actually loses the war?
So I think there are a couple. So the first is that, Russia has already lost the war by the standards that it set itself at the beginning, because what it wanted to do was stop Ukraine being an independent state. And it is now almost impossible that will happen. The odds of a Russian breakthrough in Ukraine that allows them to get into Kyiv, stop Ukraine being it. That has almost certainly failed. And indeed, the opposite has happened, which is in some ways a strategic catastrophe for Russia, which is that instead of what they wanted, which is Ukraine becoming part of a sort of greater Russia, Ukraine is now a hyper well-armed, hyper-connected test bed for the US and European defence industry. Now, this is, that is not what the Russians were looking for at the beginning of this war by any stretch of the imagination. And the question is what they do about that. They had hoped that at the very least they could take Donbass over a year or two, proclaim that as a victory, and even that looks unlikely. So you've got a couple of options. The first is that things stay where they are, but Russia isn't winning, and it decides to try and escalate along a different sort of axis. And you're already seeing the Baltic states and Poland being increasingly concerned that might mean some kind of lethal military exchange there. I had an AI intelligence firm just sort of crunch some stuff and sort of suggest there might be an 18% chance of a lethal exchange between Russia and NATO in the course of by the end of the year. Not a very big high chance, but certainly higher than we'd like. So that could be that could be the Russians attacking a Polish power station or something, possibly with a cyber attack in a deniable way, but they might just lob a missile into it and see what happened. That, of course, could then escalate quite quickly. Quite notable, we've seen the US pulling its ground forces out of Eastern Europe. So Baltic states, we've seen 500 odd troops come out of Estonia, up to 1,000 out of Lithuania. So the US is clearly pulling back on the off chance that things escalate in Europe. They don't want to have sort of hostages for fortune, soldiers in harm's way. The other option would be that Russia does even worse, and that at some stage the Ukrainians are able to threaten Crimea again. So Crimea, remember that peninsula in Ukraine, annexed by the Russians in 2014, home to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, currently having a really rough time. The Ukrainians have cut off power and all kinds of things. I think the Russians can accept losing power to something like that. But if they thought they were going to lose the territory to the Ukrainians, then I think we get back into the world that we were in at the age of 2022, where what the Russians did was start moving their nuclear weapons around and talking on channels that they knew the Americans could listen into, saying things like, we might need to use a tactical nuclear weapon. And we know that there's already worries about that, because Alexander Stubb, who is the president of Finland, talked at the NATO summit about going out and speaking to the Chinese. And the Chinese, we were talking about the Chinese, was that they're supporting the Russian ground war in Ukraine, in a sense, but they are very opposed to the idea of nuclear escalation. So they are, the Chinese and the Americans and the Europeans are all basically saying to the Russians, you can't do this under any circumstances. And the Russians, of course, keep on saying, well, actually, we will do what we deem necessary. And Russia has tried to communicate as aggressively as it can that it views Sevastopol as one of its key strategic points, and that it might go nuclear in its defense. The other strategic points are worth remembering: Murmansk up in the north, Kaliningrad, that Russian enclave on the Baltic, and obviously the St. Petersburg kind of area where Vladimir Putin grew up. Those are Russia's key ports, and Vladivostok in the Pacific. Russia would, I think, go to very great lengths to defend those, including, at the very least, nuclear posturing. But don't forget, Russia could also do other things, like detonate a single nuclear warhead in the North Atlantic. They could detonate it in international waters. There are a bunch of ways in which they could do things that are not launching a nuclear attack on a city.
And is the world slowly getting used to a permanently hostile rogue Russia, or is international resolve to isolate them starting to crack?
So, I mean, I think people are getting used to the dynamics of the ongoing Ukraine war, and they are also getting used to those dynamics shifting. So, for example, India's relationship with Russia is still quite close, but what they're actually doing is different. So they're now refining Russian oil and selling it back to India, because Zelensky's blown up all the Russian oil refineries. So I think, and the same is true in the Gulf confrontation, all of these relationships are quite close, and they're all ever evolving. So if you look at Saudi Arabia, that is probably in the process of kicking US troops out. The Americans don't really want to be in Saudi Arabia anyway. It's too close to Iran. Those bases will get struck by Iranian drones. The Saudis are very angry at the American escalation, because they think that endangers their energy plants, but also their desalination plants. So they're worried about the Iranians striking into Saudi and damaging the stuff that keeps the Saudi economy alive. So they've been moving closer to China over the last few years. Qatar is doing its own things about independent agency. They have their own relationships with the US. They have their own relationships with the UK. None of those relationships are quite where they were a year ago. Some of them are closer. So RAF, US Air Force, air defense teams have gone forward. Army defense teams have gone forward to those countries. But I would say all of those are evolving. And one of the things we're getting used to is not just either an isolated or an interconnected Russia, depending on who you are, but this idea that you have conflict in Ukraine, perennial conflict in the Gulf. In other words, you might have a week where there's not that much going on, but there's missiles going on. If you want to fly from Europe to, say, Japan, the only bit you can fly through now is a bit of the sort of Turkish border, where you then fly south of Russia across the Caucasus and then across China. The entire rest of the border, from the top of Finland down to midway through Turkey, and then from Turkey all the way down through the Gulf, is regarded as basically not quite a hot war zone, because you can, and some airlines will fly into Russian airspace, but quite a lot of airlines, say the Finns, for example, don't want to fly over Russia, partly because we saw this a few years ago. A Ryanair flight over Belarus was forced down by Belarusian jets because they wanted to arrest someone on the plane. So you're seeing this kind of this dynamic where actually the new Iron Curtain, except it's not made of iron, it's made of sort of air defense missiles, is long. People remember what happened to MH17, the Malaysian Airlines jet that got shot down over Ukraine in 2014. And we are fundamentally used. I mean, the fact that we had a NATO summit where the US and the Europeans were calmly talking to the Ukrainians about bombing Moscow would have been utterly unthinkable at any point in NATO history. Now, the NATO argument is, international law has always been clear. You can support a country to defend itself without getting involved in a war. The Americans did with us in the first 2 years of World War II, lease lend. They gave us lots of destroyers, a few aircraft, and so forth. And that was not, they were not at war with Germany. So you are allowed to do this, but it is a very unusual dynamic, and it is a dynamic of potentially constant escalation, which is why you related to earlier. Al Khan's former Minister of the Armed Forces describes the most dangerous era since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The reason he says that is there are so many moving parts. It's not just the Americans being in charge as it would have been 25, 30 years ago, or throughout the Cold War. And I don't think anyone wants to dramatically escalate. But if you look at where we are versus last year, the world is quite a bit more dangerous. And it's entirely possible that may invert, may go the other way in 2027, 2028, 2029, or we could keep gradually boiling the frog, as they say.
How long will Beijing continue to prop up a failing Russian regime before they decide Putin is more of a liability than an asset?
I think they'll probably support Russia for another couple of centuries or millennia. That is a long-lasting relationship, most likely. And it is a relationship in which, back in the early days of that relationship, so the Mao-Stalin relationship of the end of World War II, there was no question that Russia was the dominant power. In the world of the 2030s or 2020s, there's no question China is the dominant power, although Russia has that greater degree of military experience. So I would have thought that this relationship will outlast Putin and it will outlast Xi Jinping. Although, interestingly enough, neither of them have a way out. So when I don't know if you remember, but China had a big parade for the end of World War II last year, so in August of 2025, and Putin was there as the guest of honor. And there was a live microphone, and the two of them were discussing how it might be possible to extend human life to about 150 years old. So I think, and there's an element to which I think this may just be the story they tell each other. It may well not be the story their army chiefs tell them, which is one of the reasons the Chinese keep on purging their army chiefs, is that Putin and Xi Jinping tell each other, well, we could go on forever with things like transplants, and it's very, very dark stuff. It's not totally clear to me that they're looking at getting I'm not sure that the population of Russia or China want to keep giving their organs to Xi Jinping and Putin to keep living forever. But that seems to be where their sort of brains are at. And of course, you see, they're both doing different stuff with AI. So you're seeing a different sort of nature of a state. So I think the Russia-China relationship is probably going to last for a long time with schisms. The Americans talk about doing a reverse Kissinger moment. Henry Kissinger helped pull China away from Russia during the first Cold War. They would love to be able to do the same with Russia. But I think that's quite unlikely. Both Putin and Xi Jinping are in their 70s. They can't go on forever, but the model I always think about is Robert Mugabe, who kept going on until he was about 90 something, and then he was replaced by his army chief, and he was replaced by his army chief with what was fairly clearly the connivance both of China, the country, but also the connivance of the People's Liberation Army. They literally, as the wheels came off in Zimbabwe, the head of the Chinese army flew to China for consultations with his Chinese counterparts, came back and took over the country. And I've always wondered whether the Chinese counterparts, none of whom are in role anymore, incidentally, were also trying to send a signal to their own old man, don't stick around too long, which may explain why they're no longer running the Chinese army.
And what is the biggest lesson the British military and NATO are learning from how this war is being fought today in Ukraine?
So I think you need to divide that into three sort of subordinate groups. So the first question is what mainland European nations have taken as the lesson from Ukraine. And I think they've taken two or three lessons. The first is that you can't rely on the United States. The second of which is that only your own human and industrial strength will save you. In other words, the way you deter Russia from invading is you say, we have more soldiers than you, so you'll run out first. Russia has more soldiers than Ukraine, population 140 million versus Ukraine's 30 to 40 million. Mainland Europe has many more. Mainland Europe's entire strategy for deterring Russia basically involves saying, we have a nuclear umbrella from Britain, France, and the United States. We have a large population, we have a large industry, and we'll outlast you. And that means the Americans have taken a very different lesson. The American lesson is we can probably defend Taiwan and Europe and the other places we need to in the Gulf with drones and missiles and very few troops forward. So their lesson is, so the European lesson is we need an incredibly large numbers of soldiers and potential soldiers to deter Russia. The American lesson, paradoxically, is we don't need that many at all, and we should probably have fewer troops forward, and we want to operate from big, well-defended bases like Incirlik in Turkey or Jordan, or and they're putting a lot of money into Lakenheath in Britain, Lakenheath, Mildenhall, and Fairford, where we can, where we believe we're further from the Russian threat, where we believe we can defend those bases, and where we believe we can strike deep into Russia. And of course, they're ships. They've got 10 aircraft carriers and submarines and all those kind of things, and they'll have a lot longer range drones. That raises really interesting questions for Britain, because our assumption has been that we would always fight alongside the United States. That remains broadly the assumption, but of course, if the US is going to do less fighting in Europe, we might. It is entirely possible, although not necessarily likely, that military command in Europe will pass from the Americans to the Germans. We then have the question as to how we fit into that. And one of the things that's been quite interesting is the gradual eviction of Britain from the really important framework jobs, like being the framework nation for Estonia. So after Brexit, like 2 days after Brexit, the Cameron government signed a deal to put a battle group in Estonia, and we were the framework NATO nation for the defence of Estonia alongside France. We still have that battle group there, but now the command and control of a war in the Baltic states would be held by a German-Dutch corps, a corps HQ, so a large military headquarters. And the British are now tasked to deliver a reserve corps, which is the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, so that's 2 divisions worth of troops, multiple thousands of personnel. But we are designed to sort of turn up on day 2 of the war and go where they want us to. So Supreme Allied Commander Europe, currently an American, has been American since the 1950s, would decide where that corps goes. And likewise, the aircraft carrier would also go off and do whatever it was going to do. And obviously other bits would the Royal Marines would be up somewhere in the high north defending Norway, which is where the long-range missiles would be that would be threatening Murmansk. So there's a bunch of stuff that we can do, and particularly that northern piece is viewed as quite important. So the British command, the NATO commander for the sort of North Atlantic, Nordic bit of the battle is now going to be a British officer. And we've been nudged out of the NATO maritime component command. So it used to be, in the First Cold War, an admiral called Supreme Sackline, Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic, would have fought the Atlantic under US command. When we decided there wasn't going to be a major global war, they put the British in charge of NATO maritime. Now we think there might be again. The US have taken command of all NATO's maritime forces, and we have got this sort of subordinate command in the high north, and the Germans have got a sort of subordinate command down in the Baltics. And I think that tells you that people don't really know whether Britain would turn up, what it would turn up with. There is an assumption it probably would, and there is an assumption that those capabilities might be quite useful, but no one wants to be dependent on them, because we are, located too far from the front to really smell the threat. We are not upping our spending in the way that the countries that can smell the threat are doing. We're not threatened by Russia in the same way that others are. No one really expects that Russia's going to land in sort of Scotland. They might do stuff to our infrastructure and other things, but again, it is questionable whether we would be the sort of priority that they would give. If Russia really wanted to make the Baltic states disappear, most of their firepower is going to be taking out bridges in Germany, taking out stuff that will really affect that battle. So I think we struggle because we're not a main player. We're not the US. We'd quite like to be in charge, but no one really is going to let us, and everyone's being quite polite about that. I mean, I think, and we've got to make some decisions. The most interesting thing I think I've noticed is the incredible strategic politeness with which most of our allies have, A, noticed that we're not doing that well, B, decided not to comment on it, C, believe that there is probably something quite useful we could do. And I think D, which is interesting and is a legacy of the war in Helmand, that under no circumstances should we be allowed out of the box in a way that might inadvertently do what we did in Helmand, where we basically send a battle group off to try and pacify an area, kicked over a hornet's nest, and the result was a 15-year insurgency that some would argue cost us the entire Afghan war. So no one in Eastern Europe wants the British kind of charging around looking for an adventure, when what they want to do is manage escalation, as sort of in as grown up a way as possible. So I think that there's various things we could and should do, but the truth is they don't change the price of fish. I think the bigger picture hit for us is that we need to learn from what the other nations are doing in terms of longer term societal resilience and innovation, because I don't think we should look at the future through the prism that there'll definitely be a war, because I think there probably won't be. What there definitely will be, though, is a stepped up era of confrontation within nations for opportunity, industrial strength, resources, innovation. And we need to make sure that we are building a country and an economy that is able to survive in an AI world, is able to survive in a world where supply chains are not necessarily that reliable, is able to rely on a world where computing power, what people now call compute, is really important. That means energy is important. That means water is important. And it means having people who have the brain power, a new generation of people who know how to excel in this kind of space, including starting businesses and working in businesses and making money, is really important. And so I think that is what we should be thinking about, more than wasting lots of energy on should we have an extra 3 frigates or 2 frigates, because I don't think that makes so much difference.